Looking back now, I can't believe how much I didn't see. 16 years of marriage, 2 wonderful kids, and a life I thought was built on trust and stability, only to find out it was all teetering on the edge of betrayal. It started with something as simple as a lost bag. Funny how a small mishap can unravel an entire life. I'm Kevin, a 40-year-old man who thought he had it all figured out. I work as a project manager for a construction company, a stable job that keeps the bills paid and food on the table. My wife, Claire, is 38, and she's always been the more ambitious one. She works in corporate sales, a career that often has her flying across the country for meetings and conferences. Our life was, by most standards, normal. We live in a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, drive decent cars, and try to make time for our 2 kids, Jacob, 15, and Emma, 13. Weekends were usually spent shuttling between soccer games and school events, grabbing takeout on the way home because we were too exhausted to cook. Claire's job kept her busy, sometimes more than I liked, but I'd gotten used to it over the years. She'd been traveling for work since we were first married, and while it wasn't always easy, I trusted her. She'd always made it a point to check in, sending texts and photos from whatever city she was in, making me feel like I was still part of her day. But something shifted recently. At first, it was subtle. She'd come home from trips more tired than usual, brushing off my questions with vague answers about long meetings and difficult clients. Her texts during her travels became less frequent, her phone always within arm's reach when she was home. I told myself it was just work stress, that the travel was wearing her down. I never imagined it could be something more. It wasn't until her latest trip that the cracks started to show. She'd flown to Chicago for a 3-day conference, a routine trip she'd taken several times before. But this time, her bag didn't make it home with her. It got lost in transit, she told me as she walked through the door, her face flushed and annoyed. They said it should be delivered in a couple of days. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Lost luggage happens, right? But looking back now, I realize that moment was the beginning of the end. When Claire came home without her luggage, I didn't think twice about it. Lost bags were an inconvenience, sure, but nothing out of the ordinary. She was visibly frustrated, muttering about airline incompetence as she tossed her carry-on onto the couch. They said it's still in Chicago, she said, running a hand through her hair. It should be delivered tomorrow or the next day. Annoying, I replied, keeping my tone light. At least it's just a delay and not completely gone. Yeah, she said, distractedly scrolling through her phone. It's fine. She didn't seem fine, though. Claire was usually pretty composed, even in the face of stressful situations. But now, she was fidgety, pacing around the kitchen as she half-heartedly filled me in on her trip. Long meetings, she said vaguely when I asked how it went. Lots of networking. You know the drill. I did know the drill, or at least I thought I did. She'd been traveling for work for years, and her post-trip routine was always the same: drop her bags by the door, kick off her heels, and dive into a detailed rundown of her meetings, clients, and coworkers. This time, there was none of that. Instead, she was vague, evasive even. I brushed it off at first. Maybe she was just tired. Travel could be draining, especially when paired with back-to-back meetings. But over the next couple of days, her behavior became harder to ignore. For starters, she was glued to her phone. Claire was never one to be overly attached to her devices, she'd always preferred face-to-face interaction, but now, she was constantly checking it, texting someone with a level of intensity one hadn't seen before. Work stuff? I asked one evening as she sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the screen. Yeah, She replied quickly, locking the phone and setting it down on the coffee table. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't push her. But something about the way she avoided eye contact made my stomach churn. Then there was the luggage. 2 days after Claire got home, the airline delivered her missing bag. She seemed relieved, practically snatching it from the delivery guy before dragging it upstairs. Finally, she muttered as she passed me in the hallway. I expected her to unpack right away, she usually did, but this time, the suitcase stayed zipped and untouched in the corner of our bedroom. When I asked about it, she brushed me off. "I'll get to it later," she said, her tone dismissive. Later never came. Days passed, and the bag remained where she'd left it. I started to wonder if something was bothering her, something she wasn't ready to talk about. But every time I tried to bring it up, she either changed the subject or claimed she was just tired. It wasn't like her to be so closed off. Claire had always been upfront about her feelings, and we built our marriage on open communication. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I realize those were the first cracks in the facade, the subtle signs that something was wrong. But at the time, I convinced myself it was all in my head. I had no idea the truth was sitting just a few feet away, zipped up inside that suitcase. The suitcase sat in the corner of our bedroom for nearly a week, untouched. Every time I walked past it, I felt a pang of curiosity mixed with unease. Claire was meticulous about her belongings, leaving her luggage unpacked for so long was unlike her. One evening, when Claire was out with a friend, I found myself standing in front of it, staring. Something about that bag felt off, like it was holding a secret just waiting to be uncovered. I hesitated, my conscience battling my suspicion. Was I overreacting? Claire had never given me a reason not to trust her. But then again, this wasn't like her. Finally, I gave in. My hands trembled as I unzipped the bag, feeling a mix of guilt and dread. At first, everything seemed normal. Clothes, toiletries, a pair of heels, typical travel items. But as I dug deeper, I noticed things that didn't add up. There was a dress I'd never seen before, sleek, black, and far more revealing than anything Claire usually wore. It wasn't the kind of thing she'd wear to a corporate event, that was for sure. Then there was the jewelry. Claire had always kept her accessories simple, but tucked into a side pocket was a sparkling necklace that looked expensive, brand new, and completely out of character for her. And then, at the very bottom of the bag, I found it, a small, folded receipt from a high-end hotel in Chicago. It wasn't the one her company usually booked for her trips. My heart started pounding as I unfolded the slip of paper, scanning the details. It was for a suite, a room far too luxurious for a quick work trip. The check-in and check-out dates matched the days Claire was supposed to be at the conference. But what really caught my eye was the name on the receipt. It wasn't Claire's. It was a man's name. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, staring at the slip of paper as my mind raced. Who was this man? Why was his name on the receipt? And why was it in Claire's suitcase? I felt a wave of nausea as the pieces started to click together. The missed texts, the vague answers, the lost luggage, suddenly, it all made sense. When Claire came home that night, I tried to act normal, but my mind was a whirlwind of suspicion and anger. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to demand an explanation. But I held back. I needed more information before I made my move. Something wasn't right, and now, I couldn't ignore it. The discovery of the receipt gnawed at me, leaving me restless and distracted. I couldn't shake the image of the man's name printed so clearly on it, paired with the memory of the dress and jewelry tucked away in Claire's suitcase. That night, As Claire slept soundly beside me, I sat in the living room with my laptop, trying to make sense of it all. I started by looking up the name on the receipt. It didn't take long to find him. A quick search revealed he was a regional sales director for a company that often partnered with Claire's. He lived in Chicago. My stomach churned as I stared at his LinkedIn profile picture. He was older than me, probably in his mid-40s, with a confident smile and a polished look. Something about him radiated arrogance, and I hated him instantly. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention to Claire's behavior. She seemed anxious, always glancing at her phone and stepping out of the room to take calls. Her excuses grew thinner, and her once detailed stories about work trips were reduced to vague generalities. "Who were you talking to?" I asked casually one evening when she came back from the patio, where she'd been whispering into her phone. "Oh, just a client," she said quickly, brushing past me. Her tone was off, too rushed, too dismissive. The turning point came a few days later when she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she went to take a shower. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but after everything I'd found, my curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and hesitated. Was I really about to do this? Part of me felt like I was crossing a line, but the other part, the part that needed answers, won out. Unlocking the phone, I navigated to her messages. Most of them were innocent enough, but then I saw his name, Mark. My heart pounded as I opened the thread. The messages were damning. "Mark, I can't stop thinking about last weekend. You looked incredible in that dress. Claire, you're sweet. I had such a good time with you. Can't wait until next month." I kept scrolling, my hands shaking. The texts painted a picture I didn't want to see: plans for private dinners, inside jokes, and hints at a relationship that went far beyond professional. Then, I saw the photo. It was a selfie Claire had sent him, taken in what I recognized as the hotel suite from the receipt. She was wearing the black dress I'd found in her suitcase, her smile radiant and playful. I put the phone down, feeling like the air had been knocked out of me. There it was, proof that my wife had been unfaithful, right in front of me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, smiling, sharing moments that should have been ours. I thought about the years we'd spent building a life together, the promises we'd made, the family we'd created. How could she throw it all away? The betrayal wasn't just about the affair, it was about the lies, the deception, the way she'd hidden this from me while pretending everything was fine. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth was out, and now, I had to decide what to do with it. Confronting the truth wasn't as simple as I thought it would be. I had all the evidence I needed, messages, photos, and a receipt, but saying the words out loud, acknowledging that Claire had betrayed me, felt like ripping open a wound I wasn't ready to face. For days, I carried the weight of her betrayal silently, trying to act normal around her and the kids. Jacob and Emma were sharp, though, and it wasn't long before they started noticing something was off. "Dad, are you okay?" Emma asked one evening as I helped her with her homework. "Yeah, sweetheart," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, that's all." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't push, either. I hated lying to her, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening, not yet. Meanwhile, Claire's behavior became even harder to ignore. She was still glued to her phone, still stepping outside to take calls, and still giving me vague, half-hearted excuses when I asked about her day. It was like she didn't even realize I'd started pulling away, too consumed by her own double life to notice. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. The anger, the sadness, the confusion, It all boiled over as we lay in bed, staring at the ceiling in silence. "I know about Mark," I said quietly, my voice breaking the stillness of the room like a thunderclap. Claire froze beside me. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "What are you talking about?" she finally said, her voice shaky. I sat up, turning to face her. "I know, Claire. About Chicago. About the hotel. About him." Her eyes widened, and I saw the color drain from her face. "Dan, I don't." "Don't lie to me," I interrupted, my voice firmer now. "I saw the messages. The receipt. The photo. I know everything." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. But there was nothing she could say to undo what I discovered. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do this?" Tears welled up in her eyes, and for a moment, I thought she might tell me the truth. But instead, she launched into excuses. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Mark and we just got close because of work. It was nothing serious, I swear." "Nothing serious?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You expect me to believe that after everything I've seen? After what you've done?" She started crying then, her hands covering her face as she shook her head. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she sobbed. "I love you, Dan. I do. I don't know what I was thinking." Her words felt hollow, like a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. And as much as I wanted to believe her, I couldn't ignore the pain clawing at my chest, the image of her with Mark seared into my mind. The hardest part wasn't just realizing she betrayed me, it was the realization that this might not have been the first time. How many other trips had there been? How many other lies? That night, I slept on the couch, unable to be in the same room as her. As I lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, I felt the full weight of her betrayal settle on my shoulders. The woman I'd loved, trusted, and built a life with had broken something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. The days that followed were tense and filled with a painful silence. Claire and I tiptoed around each other, barely speaking unless it was absolutely necessary. I could feel her watching me, gauging my mood, trying to figure out what I was thinking. Then, one evening, she broke the silence. "Dan," she said softly, standing in the doorway of the living room where I'd been nursing a drink. "Can we talk?" I looked up at her, my expression blank. "Talk about what?" "About us. About what happened." I sighed, setting my glass down. "Fine. Talk." She sat down across from me, her posture hesitant, like she was afraid I'd lash out at her. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice trembling. "And I know I've made mistakes. But I swear, Dan, I never meant to ruin what we have." "What we had," I corrected, my tone cold. She flinched but pushed on. "I've been thinking a lot about why this happened, and, maybe I felt like we were drifting apart. You've been so focused on work, on the kids, and I guess I felt neglected." Her words stung, but they also infuriated me. "Neglected?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Claire, I've spent the last 16 years doing everything I can to support this family. I've been here, every single day, while you were off God knows where doing God knows what. Don't you dare put this on me." Tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head. "I'm not trying to blame you, Dan. I'm just trying to explain. I got caught up in something I didn't know how to get out of. But it's over now. I ended it with Mark. I want to fix this. I want to fix us. Her words sounded desperate, but something about them felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing them in the mirror. I don't know if I believe you, I said finally, my voice quieter now. How do I know this is the first time? How do I know there isn't someone else waiting in the wings? There's no one else, she insisted, leaning forward. I promise you, Dan. This was a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake, and I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Her pleas almost got to me. Despite everything, a part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that we could somehow salvage what we had. But the doubt lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I told her I needed time to think, and she agreed, giving me space while she worked overtime to show me she was serious about making amends. She cooked dinner every night, showered me with affection, and even deleted Mark's number from her phone in front of me. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, there was a chance we could move past this. But then, a few days later, I found the proof that shattered any hope I had left. I'd been cleaning out the car when I found it, a crumpled napkin tucked between the seats, with a scrawled note in Claire's handwriting. Mark, I can't wait to see you again. Last weekend was incredible. Love, C. My chest tightened as I read the words, anger and heartbreak flooding through me all over again. She hadn't ended it. She'd been lying to my face the entire time. That night, I confronted her with the napkin, and her reaction told me everything I needed to know. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try to make excuses. She just broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, as I walked out of the room. Whatever shred of trust one had left was gone. The aftermath of finding that note was brutal. I felt numb, like a stranger in my own life, moving through the days on autopilot. The betrayal wasn't just mine to bear anymore, our kids would eventually sense that something was wrong. I tried to keep it together for their sake, but the cracks in our marriage were too big to hide. It wasn't long before Jacob and Emma started asking questions. Dad, Jacob said one evening, cornering me in the garage as I pretended to fix something that wasn't broken. Is everything okay between you and Mom? His tone was cautious, but his face was filled with worry. At 15, Jacob was perceptive, far more than I'd given him credit for. I hesitated, unsure of how much to tell him. Why do you ask? He shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms. You two don't talk much anymore. And you're sleeping in the guest room. Emma noticed too. I sighed, setting down the wrench in my hand. There was no point in lying to him. Things are complicated right now, I said. But don't worry about it, Jacob. This is between me and your mom. He frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. Did she do something? His question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Jacob, I began, but the words stuck in my throat. Dad, I'm not a kid anymore, he said firmly. Just tell me the truth. I took a deep breath, leaning against the workbench. Your mom made some choices that hurt me, I said carefully. And it's going to take some time for us to figure out what happens next. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Did she cheat on you? His bluntness stunned me, and I didn't answer right away. But my silence was all the confirmation he needed. I knew it, he muttered, his hands balling into fists. I knew something was going on. She's been acting so weird lately. Before I could say anything, he turned and stormed out of the garage, slamming the door behind him. Later that night, Emma approached me in the living room, her expression hesitant. Dad, she said softly, sitting beside me on the couch. What is it, sweetheart? Is it true? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did Mom cheat on you?" I closed my eyes, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "Who told you that?" "Jacob," she admitted. "He's really upset." I hesitated, torn between protecting her innocence and being honest. But Emma was 13, old enough to understand that life isn't always fair. "Yes," I said finally. "Your mom made some mistakes." Emma's eyes welled up with tears, and she buried her face in my shoulder. "Why would she do that?" she sobbed. "Why would she hurt you?" I held her tightly, stroking her hair as I fought back my own tears. "I don't know, Emma," I said. "But no matter what happens, I'm here for you. Always." Over the next few days, both kids made it clear where their loyalties lay. They avoided Claire, barely speaking to her and giving her cold, distant looks whenever she tried to engage them. "Jacob, can we talk?" she asked one morning as he grabbed his backpack for school. "No," he said flatly, walking out the door without another word. Emma wasn't much better. When Claire tried to hug her one evening, she shrugged her off and walked away. Watching the kids pull away from her broke my heart, but it also gave me strength. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, that I still had people who loved and believed in me. Claire, on the other hand, was crumbling. She spent most of her time in the bedroom, crying or staring blankly at the wall. For the first time, I saw her truly grapple with the consequences of her actions. But by then, it was too late. It didn't take long for Claire's betrayal to ripple beyond the walls of our home. News has a way of spreading, even when you don't want it to, and her affair with Mark soon became the talk of her workplace. I didn't have to do anything to expose her. Claire's distance from me, combined with her unusual behavior, had already raised eyebrows at the office. People started putting two and two together, and before long, the truth about her relationship with Mark was out in the open. Claire came home one afternoon looking pale and shaken. "They called me into HR today," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, waiting for her to continue. They've been hearing rumors about Mark and me," she said, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "They asked if it was true." I didn't know what to say. Her hands trembled as she buried her face in them. "They're launching an investigation. I might lose my job." I stood in the doorway, watching her crumble under the weight of her actions. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. Losing her job would be devastating, but I couldn't forget how she'd put us all in this position in the first place. "You should have thought about that before you got involved with him," I said finally, my tone cold. Claire didn't respond. She just sat there, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. A week later, she came home with her things packed in a box. Her company had terminated her, citing a breach of their code of conduct. Mark didn't come out of it unscathed either. He was let go shortly after, though I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was already job hunting in another state. The fallout didn't end there. Our kids, already distant from Claire, grew even more withdrawn. Jacob refused to even sit at the dinner table with her, and Emma barely acknowledged her presence. The pain they felt was clear, and their loyalty to me only seemed to deepen as they witnessed the consequences of their mother's actions. Why did she have to ruin everything? Jacob muttered one evening as he sat on the back porch with me. "I wish I had an answer for you," I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But I don't." Claire, meanwhile, spiraled into a depression. She spent most of her time in bed, barely eating or speaking. At one point, I found her sobbing uncontrollably in the bathroom, clutching an old family photo. "I've lost everything," she said through tears. "My job, my family, my kids. I don't even know who I am anymore. Her breakdown left me feeling conflicted. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to help her pick up the pieces. But the other part, the part that remembered the lies, the betrayal, the pain, couldn't bring itself to care. Eventually, Claire's condition worsened to the point where she had to be hospitalized for her mental health. I made sure the kids knew what was happening but kept the details vague. "Mom's in the hospital," I told them one evening. "She needs some time to get better." Neither of them said much in response. Jacob just nodded, his expression hard, while Emma looked down at her lap, silent. The truth was, Claire's actions had left scars on all of us. And while she was now paying the price, the damage couldn't be undone. Claire's hospitalization marked the beginning of the end for our marriage. While she received treatment, I focused on keeping life as normal as possible for Jacob and Emma. It wasn't easy, they were both still struggling with the fallout, and I often caught them lost in thought, their faces heavy with emotions they couldn't yet articulate. When Claire was discharged a few weeks later, she returned home looking fragile, a shadow of the woman I'd once known. She tried to mend things with the kids, but the damage was too deep. "Mom, I don't want to talk right now," Jacob said bluntly when she approached him in the kitchen one afternoon. Emma was more polite but equally distant. "I'm glad you're feeling better, Mom," she said softly before walking upstairs. Watching their rejection broke something in her, and though I felt for her, I couldn't blame them. They had seen the pain her actions had caused me, and their loyalty was firmly with their father. Claire and I tried counseling, but it quickly became clear that we were just going through the motions. Every session felt like a battle between guilt and resentment, and no amount of talking could erase what had happened. One evening, as we sat in the living room in strained silence, Claire finally spoke. "I think we should get a divorce," she said, her voice trembling. I looked at her, surprised by the suddenness of her statement, but also relieved. "I've been thinking the same thing," I admitted. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve another chance, Dan. I know that. But I hope one day you can forgive me." Forgiveness. It felt like an impossible concept at that moment. But I simply nodded, not wanting to prolong the conversation. The divorce proceedings were straightforward, thanks to the overwhelming evidence of her affair. The court awarded me primary custody of the kids, as well as the house. Claire kept her car and a modest portion of our savings, but she was effectively starting over from scratch. The day she moved out was surreal. Watching her pack up her belongings and walk out the door felt like the end of an era, one filled with both joy and heartbreak. "I'm sorry," she said, standing on the porch with her suitcase in hand. "I know," I replied, my voice steady. She hesitated, as if she wanted to say more, but then she turned and walked away. The kids took the divorce hard, but they remained supportive of me. Jacob started stepping up around the house, helping out in ways I hadn't expected, while Emma became my emotional anchor, always checking in to make sure I was okay. As for Claire, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd found a small apartment and was working part-time while continuing therapy. She'd lost the career she'd worked so hard for, and her relationship with the kids was strained at best. The person she had become was a far cry from the ambitious, driven woman I'd married. In the months following the divorce, I felt an unexpected sense of peace. It wasn't that the pain of Claire's betrayal had vanished, it hadn't. But with each passing day, the weight of it grew lighter, and I started to see a future beyond the wreckage of our marriage. The kids were my lifeline. Jacob and Emma gave me a sense of purpose, their loyalty and love reminding me that I hadn't lost everything. We settled into a new routine, one that felt stable and even comforting. Weekends became our time to reconnect, movie nights, hikes, or just sitting around a kitchen table laughing about nothing in particular. I threw myself into my work as well, finding satisfaction in projects that challenged me and kept my mind occupied. Over time, I realized that I'd been neglecting my own ambitions for years, putting Claire's career ahead of my own. Now, for the first time, I allowed myself to dream again. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but I eventually found it, not for Claire's sake, but for mine. Holding on to the anger felt like dragging a weight behind me, and I didn't want to carry it any longer. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the kids play basketball in the driveway, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the heartbreak, the divorce, it had all been devastating, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about resilience and self-worth. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can't control what others do, but you can control how you respond. Life will knock you down, but it's up to you to get back up and keep moving forward. Claire still reaches out occasionally, mostly to check in on the kids. Her relationship with them remains strained, but she's trying, and I respect that. As for me, I've let go of the past. There's no point dwelling on what's already done. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm no longer afraid of it. For the first time in years, I feel free to live, to grow, and to embrace whatever comes next. Sometimes, it takes losing everything to realize what truly matters. And for me, that's the unwavering love of my kids, the strength I've discovered within myself, and the knowledge that even in the face of heartbreak, life goes on. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter.